So now we're going to talk about the anatomy of the Constitution, the breakdown of the different structures and features of the Constitution. So this is really an important component because it talks about the specifics of the Constitution and um, the overall structure. Now, one of the first things I want to tell you is that even though it has 4,500 words, it's only 4 sheets of paper. And you created over 200 years ago. It's the oldest constitution that is still in use that's been written down. The crazy part about it is it's a pretty short document and it's fairly vague. In other words, it doesn't tell exactly what to do in every situation, and really that's why it's lasted so long, because the government has been able to adjust and adapt to the needs of our country as they come up. So it's a very flexible document. So remember, the Constitution is vague and it's not detailed. It's very short. Okay, so it starts off with the preamble, and that's the "We the People of the United States" part that you all remember and maybe had to memorize in earlier grades. But it talks about the why. What's the purpose of our government? Why do we have this new government? Then in Article 1, it creates the legislative branch. That's how we make our laws. And we figured out in an earlier section that we had a House and Senate that was created by the Great Compromise, and that's the legislative branch. And since it's a branch of government that represents the people, it's a representative democracy, and it's Congress, the House and the Senate. And we'll talk about the House and the Senate, oops, sorry about that, in more detail later in a different unit. But this is the breakdown of the House and the Senate as you see it on the screen right now. You don't have to worry about that at this time. The next thing about Congress is it has a number of powers to both lawmaking and non-lawmaking, and you don't have to worry about that now either, because you'll have to know it later, but we're not going to deal with it now. Article number 2 creates the presidency, and that's the job given to someone to carry out the laws or execute the laws created by Congress. So it's the job of the president to make sure that the laws happen, or to be the executor of the laws, to make sure that they are enforced. Okay? And we'll talk about the powers of the president later too. Article 3 is something that did not exist in the Articles of Confederation, in that we had a court system at the federal level. And at the top of that level was the Supreme Court. And we'll talk about that later. Now, the interesting part about the Supreme Court is that when the Constitution was established, we had a question about whether or not the courts would have the ultimate say in what happened. And in a very important case called Madison versus Marbury, the Supreme Court was clearly determined that because of that ruling, that the Supreme Court would have the final say. It's a very, very important component of our Constitution, and it's called judicial review, established by Marbury versus Madison, and you need to know that for the purposes of our test. And so you're going to see that later, but I also think it's also an important part of Unit 1. Marbury versus Madison, judicial review, and that's a part of our Article 3 Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court has the power to review whether or not a law is constitutional. Very, very important. The fourth article talks about the states, that they have power too. And this is a really important part of our law, and it has to do with federalism, that our national government has laws and our state governments have laws at the same time. That's called federalism. The central national government is one part of government, and the state government is also a part of government. So I can be a U.S. citizen that has to follow U.S. laws, and at the same time, I can be a state citizen of a state like Minnesota, and I have to follow the laws of Minnesota. Now, we already talked about if one is in conflict with the other, if a national law is created that would be different than a state law, the national law will always be supreme, and that's called the Supremacy Clause. We don't want to forget that, okay? And the rest of it we don't have to worry too much about, except We also know from before that the states have to respect the law and court decisions of other states. We're not going to talk about extradition right now. And that's it. That's all we need to talk about at this point. Article 5 talks about amending the Constitution, and that's very important, and we'll talk about that in the next page. Article 6 talks about supremacy. Once again, federalism, that the national government shares power with the states, but the national government will be supreme, that if the laws and treaties of the U.S. are the supreme law of the land, and if a state disagrees, the federal law will always win. And of course, Article 7, back to that amendment to the Constitution. And initially, it was the ratification. How do we make the law of the Constitution legitimate? And it had to be passed by at least 9 of the 13 states in order for the Constitution to be enacted. Now let's talk about that amendment process again. And there's a two-step process. One is to propose the amendment, and the other is to ratify or make it count. In order to propose it, you needed to have 2/3 of a vote in both houses of Congress, or 2/3 of state legislatures to hold a constitutional convention, but nobody's ever done that before. If it gets passed by 2/3 of the House and Senate, then it goes over to be ratified, and 3/4 of state legislatures or a convention has to approve it. So let's look at a chart that would show you how that works. The most common way is to get a 2/3 vote of Congress, and then 3/4 of the state legislatures would then each have to ratify it, and then you'd have a new amendment. Now, only one time has it been done where there was a special state convention, and that had to do with prohibition. But the top one that's kind of in bold is really the way that it's been done. We only have 27 amendments, and the first 10 of those were called, as we know, the Bill of Rights. And we'll talk about the Bill of Rights later.